Rabbi Mathur, teach us.
Okay, continuing with the malacha of winnowing, selecting, and sifting. Okay, so let's continue here. One is permitted to extract the unwanted if some of it is left behind. For example, one may remove unwanted cream from milk if one leaves behind some of the cream. Then, the term immediate use means within the time it would reasonably take to prepare for the forthcoming meal. Such a period may vary according to the size of the meal and the amount of preparation required. For example, a caterer preparing for a large kiddush would be allowed to peel food 2 hours beforehand, whereas a person serving oneself would not require more than a few minutes. One may set the table with a bunch of silverware for an imminent meal, that is, taking wanted from unwanted for immediate use. If one wishes to set the table on Friday night for Shabbos morning, one may not sort the pieces as they are not going to be for immediate use. A practical solution is to scatter them whereby they are no longer in a bunch. Each fork, knife, and spoon can then be put in its place. When putting silverware in a drawer, it may not be sorted into separate compartments. One may not wash dirty fruit or vegetables if most people are unlikely to eat the food in such an unclean state. Unwashed food, which is nevertheless regarded as eatable, may be rinsed in the normal way, and even if it is not for immediate consumption. One may use a sink strainer or a sink tidy, which prevents lumps from falling down the drain. Although this type of separation is taking place, one requires neither the water nor the solids, but the prevention of the drain from becoming blocked. It is permitted to place a filter over a tap to ensure that no worms are emitted with the water. And lastly, further examples of prohibited selection: removing fat from soup. Permitted methods will be mentioned later. Removing oil from sardines, separating fried fish from cooked fish. That is two types of the same food, one of which is unwanted. Choosing clothing from a drawn Friday night as to be worn in the morning, not for immediate use. And lastly, using a potato peeler, a utensil specially made for selection. Okay.
Thank you, Kev.
Thanks.
I appreciate it.
Cool.
Kev, when you give the shiur, can you just face us? You had your side or back of the head towards us.
Oh, sorry, if the light is not so good, yeah. So okay, I'll try. I could have actually faced, yeah, okay.
No problem. All right, guys, I'm going to share the screen with you and show you this Mishnah, and actually show you that this Gemara is harder than what at first appeared. Okay, I'm going to share this particular screen, and I'm going to ask. Arthur, do you want to read it carefully?
Yeah, I'll give it a shot.
Okay.
Okay. This Mishnah turns its attention to the muad ox. It teaches the law of an ox that gores certain species but not others, or that gores on certain days but not others. An ox that is muad regarding animals of its own species, therefore oxen, but is not a muad regarding animals not of its own species. Or an ox that is muad regarding people, but is not muad regarding animals. Or one that is muad regarding young animals, example calves, but is not a muad regarding mature animals. This is its law. For goring those creatures regarding which is a muad, the owner pays full damage. But for goring those creatures regarding which is not a muad, the owner pays only half damages. A question regarding a related case. Therefore the disciples said to Rav Yehuda, if it is a muad regarding the Shabbos, but is not muad regarding the weekdays, what is its law? Rav Yehuda said to them, for goring on the Shabbos, the owner pays full damages. For goring on weekdays, he pays half damages. Rav Yehuda adds, and when is this animal a tam? Therefore, when does it revert to a tam status? When it desists from goring on 3 Sabbath days.
Okay, good. All right. Now, Kevin, I don't know if you had a chance to do any chazorah with that when you went to shul or not. If you didn't, there's no problem. Just let me know.
Yeah, I did go over that. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's just go through it piece by piece. Now, Gavin, the Mishnah is relatively easier. The Gemara is quite hard because the wording that it uses sometimes is intuitively understood the opposite way. So it's not as straightforward as it would seem, unfortunately. Are you with me? So if one's
that's why you're here.
Sorry, I wish Rabbi Cohen was here, but you stuck with me, guys. All right. So let's just go through it piece by piece. Once you understand the Mishnah, it's going to make it a little bit easier. So what we're trying to distinguish here is about habitual patterns. If there's a habitual pattern that occurs, even if it's not consecutive, it's considered to be muad. So, for example, what we're going to learn in the next Mishnah is if it does one session of goring, then restrains itself once, then another session of goring, then it restrains itself, then another session and restrains. That's a pattern. That's what you call an alternative pattern. The previous Mishnah that we learned, there was no pattern. It gored once, took a break, gored again, then took a break 3 times, then gored again. There's no pattern there. So there's certain things that determine pattern, time and preference, time and preference. So here we're saying, look, as far as species are concerned, generally what will happen is that oxen are very territorial and they get very irked by their own species, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily get irritated with a competing species unless it feels threatened. Does that make sense? So often you'll have, for example, a creature like a cat that will start hissing or boxing or whatever, a dog, but that's because it's feeling threatened. It doesn't feel that it really wants to overtake territory or anything as far as that's concerned. So generally the consensus is that what would upset it most in terms of a territorial dispute would be its own species. So it says as follows, an ox that is muad, meaning forewarned, in other words, a habitual gorer regarding animals of its own species, is not necessarily muad regarding animals that's not of its own species. So if, for example, it's an ox, we don't necessarily assume that it's going to react badly when it comes to horses or donkeys or perhaps sheep. Fine. That's very straightforward. That's your first statement. Your second statement is, or an ox that is muad regarding people, but is not muad regarding animals. Okay? Meaning it's got a habitual nature to attack people, but not animals. We're going to go through why that is actually counterintuitive. If you remember, there was a discussion of this on the second daf with Rav Papa when we first started the Gemara, and we're going to explain why. Or the third statement is that what's muad regarding young animals, such as a calf, is not necessarily muad regarding a mature animal. This is the law. For goring those creatures regarding which it is muad, the owner pays full damages, but for goring those creatures regarding which is not muad, the owner pays only half damages. Now, something should alert you here. There's something that's going to be addressed. The first thing is, why is it mentioning a fact that it's mentioned 100 times? We all know by the 37th daf that muad implies full payment, nezek shalem, and that chatzi nezek which is half payment damages, is for a tam. Why is it mentioning it again? That should obviously spark you as a bit odd, because the Gemara never mentions anything that's superfluous. It's not quite like the Torah in the sense that the Torah doesn't waste any word. But here, you must know that the Mishnah is as brief as anything, unlike the Gemara, which expands itself. So why is it mentioning something we've learned so many times before? A question to a related case, the disciples said before Rabbi Yehuda, if it is muad regarding the Sabbath, but it's not muad regarding the weekdays, what is the law? For goring on the Sabbath, the owner pays full damages. For gorings on weekdays, he pays half damages. That was Rabbi Yehuda's response. Okay? So it appears, which we're going to ask now, what is this issue regarding Shabbat? And why would an animal act differently to Shabbat? Rabbi Yehuda adds, and when is this animal a tam? When does it revert to a tam status? When it desists from goring on 3 Shabbat days. Okay? So one of the things I'd like to address with you guys is this issue is that if an ox goes on 3 consecutive Shabbats, right? But it has to be on 3 consecutive Shabbases. Otherwise, just like an ox, it doesn't establish a pattern unless it's consecutive. But it's observed that the animal didn't attack during the weekdays. Now, do you have any insight, if you guys did Chazorah, why it would attack on Shabbat?
I also found that strange, but I did see this. I don't recall seeing an answer to this.
Okay, so how a pattern is established is as follows. This is where it becomes a little bit odd, is that Jews are not allowed to work their animals on Shabbat. So when an animal is being worked all the time, and it's not idle, it doesn't have time because it's being whipped into submission and obviously plowing. They never had tractors or diesel or anything like that. Your animal had a plow, and an animal would be forced to toil the soil and the ground, etc., etc. It was your tractor. So during the week, it would be working. So Shabbos, it had a lot of time in its hands. So generally, when an animal doesn't follow its normal routine, the Gemara terms it a sense of arrogance and self-satisfaction that leads it to act freely upon its destructive urges. That's according to Rashi and Tosfot. That's according to Rashi. But a simple way, I couldn't see an animal necessarily being arrogant, but what it means is that if it's got time to itself, it's naturally destructive, an animal. Naturally destructive. That's according to Rashi. Tosfot's got a different opinion. He's saying that people don special clothing and adornments on Shabbat. So ox is unable to recognize them and become disturbed and attacks. So I'll give you an example. My mom, when she was younger, it was interesting. She told me once that, because my mom had long black hair, is that when she had her hair up in a bun with a towel, her cat hissed and tried to attack her. Okay? So that when you look different, your animals don't perceive the same. They've got these episodes on YouTube that when people shave their beards, even their toddlers don't recognize them. I'm sure you've seen these little clips, Gav.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? They show before and after where the child has only even known the parent with the beard, and now suddenly it's off. It takes a few seconds to recognize. So animals are very habitual creatures. I remember my mom's mom had a dog, Tutu, and what happens is in Suruddin, the neighborhood dogs would come over to visit because everybody was relaxing on Saturday. And what happened is the dog would hide its food under the bed on a Saturday. How it knew it was a Saturday, no one knew. No one knew. But it hid its food every Saturday because it knew the other dogs in the neighborhoods would be coming. So animals do respect a certain routine. Okay, so as far as that's concerned, we're going to hit straight into the Gemara. So the Gemara basically discusses a dispute between Rav David and Rav Papa. Now, I'm going to share something in my screen, and I want you guys to tell me what you think, okay? Just give me a second. I'm just doing a screenshot. Okay. All right. Now, let me just share my screen. I want you guys to read this initially and see if it makes any sense to you, to yourself. Because I'll tell you a problem with what the Gemara brings in terms of its wording. Okay? Just read it for a minute, guys. Tell me when you're done.
But the whole thing, all the way across?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're not as fast as you. Give us a second. We're not even halfway. Done.
Okay, so read it aloud, Gavin, and then it'll make sense what I'm saying now.
Okay, the Gemara cites a dispute between, regarding the Mishnah's reading. It was stated, Rab Zebid said, but it's not a word, is what the Mishnah taught. According to Rab Zebid, the Mishnah reads thus: an ox that is muad regarding animals of its own species, but is not muad regarding animals not of its own species. But Rav Papa said, is not a muad is what the Mishnah taught. According to Rav Papa, this is the way the Mishnah reads. An ox that is muad regarding animals of its own species, not muad regarding animals not of its own species. According to Rav Zebid, these words set forth the Mishnah's case of an ox, while muad regarding its own species, known to be a muad regarding other species. According to Rav Papa, these words represent the Mishnah's ruling. This is what you asked me earlier today, was on this.
Correct.
That an ox known, no, I do remember it now, fine. That an ox known to be a muad regarding its own species, assumed not to be a muad regarding other species. The Gemara sets forth the ramification of this dispute. Rav Zebed said, but is not a muad is what the Mishnah taught, meaning that the ox is known not to be a muad regarding other species. This implies that if the ox tendencies regarding other species are not known, it is assumed to be muad for all species. Rav Papa said, it is not muad is what our Mishnah taught, meaning that if the ox tendencies regarding other species are not known, it is not muad. That's the same thing.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. All right. So what is it actually saying, guys? I want to see if you can chap what it's saying.
So I think I know. Kevin, you want to give it a try?
Each of you give it a try.
Anybody?
Guys?
I'll answer otherwise. Okay, so I'll tell you then. So basically what's happening here is that Rab Zebed is saying that that an animal is considered muad for any species, regardless. So if it's muad, it's muad. So if it's an ox and it goes after a sheep, then it's muad for that sheep as well. If it kills that sheep or damages that sheep, it's muad. Whereby Rav Papa says, no, that's not true. It's not muad. It's only muad for a specific species. For any other species where it's never attacked that species before, then but the default position that it's tam. It's not muad.
Okay, that's 100% correct. But that's based on the fact that you spent about an hour learning it, right? But when you read it initially, look what the problem is. I'm going to show you something. Okay. If we'll just get this here. Let me just go slightly.
I spent an hour reading it, not an hour learning it. Just make sure I want to get it
okay,
right.
But just look here. It was stated, Rab Zavid said, but it is not a muad is what the Mishnah taught. According to Rav Zavid, the Mishnah reads thus: an ox that is muad regarding animals of its own species, but it's not muad regarding animals not of its own species. Now, the problem with the way it's explained in the Gemara is it's sounding opposite to what you're saying. Gavin, what you're saying is 100% correct, but it's not saying that here. That's the problem when Chazorah isn't done properly. It's implying the opposite. Can you see that?
Okay, so my hour was good.
So I'm saying what you said was dead perfect. But what I'm saying is, guys, if you read it just on that part here, it doesn't sound like it. Can you understand what I'm saying, Rav? It's Arthur there.
Yeah, that specific line is very tricky with the note 13 on there. See, I never read the notes, which is part of the problem, which you should do when you've got time, because it does elaborate on it.
It is kind of misleading that.
It's very misleading. So
that particular line is the worst line there.
In other words, that line itself messed me up, but it's not muad. So there you're thinking, okay, but it's muad for everybody else, but it's not muad for other species. So the way it's explained here isn't very clear. The way you explained it was fine, Gavin, because you understood after learning for an hour. But here it's saying Rav Papa said it's not muad is what the Mishnah taught. So it seems like they agree here, when in fact what Gavin said is 100% correct. So I'm just bringing it into your attention, Arth, because it might not seem super clear. I'm going to share my chart and say that, Gavin, you did very, very, very well considering. It wasn't clear. You know what I'm saying? Very well. So I'm going to share my screen and explain the discussion very simply here. So exactly as Gavin said, Rav Zavid, his default position is that when it's muad for one, it's muad for all species and situations, unless it's known as a tam in another case. So in other words, unless you know in that particular case, and what do we mean by knowing? Is that there were witnesses, and witnesses saw that it gored 3 different oxen, or 1 ox 3 times successively, right? And in that particular case, it had opportunities, or it doesn't even have to be necessarily in a row. In other words, it gored an ox, it took a break. It saw a donkey, it didn't do anything. It gored another ox, took a break. Saw a horse, didn't do anything. Gored an ox, took a break. Saw a sheep, did nothing. So there were witnesses to the fact that it didn't react to any other species. And if that is known, then that is an exception. But the default position is exactly as Gavin said for Rav Zavid, that if it's assumed muad for one species, there's no reason to think that it wouldn't be muad for another species. Why? Because an animal, according to Rav Zavid, is not decompartmentalized. In other words, if you have an aggressive person, a person's aggressive. If you have an aggressive animal, they're aggressive. They're either tame and docile, or they're aggressive by nature. There'd be no reason to think that they would be tame for another species. And if I wanted to ask you something, if you knew somebody was a sex offender, lahavdil, and had a prison sentence, would you want to let them spend time babysitting your children?
No, never.
Never. Why? Because if it had incidents where it did time, and maybe those kids were blonde-haired and blue eyes, we can't assume that if you have a brunette kid, that it doesn't have an affinity for a brunette kid necessarily. I'm using this lahavdil.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm saying, who the heck would take a chance on their child? Nobody. So that's what Rav Zavid would imply. I'm not saying he said it. I don't want to get in trouble in Shemaim, but I'm just using this as my own moshel. Fine. So if it's saying that it's tame for people, in other words, it might be so fine. If it's known as tame for people, they're witnesses that it only reacts to adult oxen, etc. The default is, unless there's evidence to the contrary, it's muad for all species and situations. Rav Papa is saying that it's not necessarily so. So if an ox is muad for its own species, for example, like oxen, maybe it's only because oxen represent a territorial threat to it. And it's not automatically assumed to be muad for other species or types. I'll give you an example. You might say, which we're going to bring up in the Gemara, that an animal is more susceptible to attack the vulnerable, like small children or calves, but it might not want to pick on something twice its own size. Therefore, it's discerning for its own self-preservation. So therein lies the difference of opinion between both of them. Now, there is another opinion, not another opinion, there's another specificity, and that is that the one is talking about behavior and the other one is talking about halacha. Does that make sense? So Rav Zvid...
David, you froze. It's fine. You're back to normal.
Sorry, Rav Zvid is talking about halacha here, and Rav Papa is talking about circumstantial behavior. Okay, so it's just a discerning point that we've got in now. So let's just go through the Gemara and see what this actually means. And I'm going to read the Gemara. You have to actually skip past the first page to really get a sense of it. So the Gemara started a dispute regarding the Mishnah's reading. It was stated, Rav Zvid said, but is not a muad is what the Mishnah taught. According to Rav Zvid, the Mishnah reads thus: an ox that is a muad regarding animals of its own species, but is not a muad regarding animals not of its own species. So that would imply almost what Rav Papa is saying, because it interrupts itself, the Gemara, or the explanation in the Schottenstein, Gavin. It could be the Schottenstein, I don't know. It says, but Rav Papa said it's not a muad, is what the Mishnah taught. According to Rav Papa, this is the way the Mishnah reads. An ox that is muad regarding animals of its own species is not a muad regarding animals not of its own species. Okay? Now, what I'm saying is, if I'm doing I'm just going to share the screen capture. Give me 1 sec, off. Okay. Okay, guys, I just want to share my screen. Gavin, you did exceptionally well with this. All right, so read this here. It was stated, Rav Zvid said, but is not a muad what the Mishnah taught. According to Rav Zvid, the Mishnah reads, thus an ox that is muad regarding animals of its own species, but is not a muad regarding animals not of its own species. And then Rav Papa is seeming to say the same thing. According to Rav Papa, this is the way the Mishnah reads: an ox that is muad regarding animals of its own species is not a muad regarding animals not of its own species. Now, guys, please tell me from that first position in the Schottenstein how those two are different.
Yeah, that's very hard to say. You have to read that whole thing.
Exactly. So that's all I'm saying is you cannot ever draw an inference by just reading the first paragraph. I'm just going to quickly read on. Gavin, well done for reading between the lines. I'm impressed. According to Rav Zvid, these words set forth the Mishnah's case of an ox that, while a muad regarding its own species, is known not to be a muad regarding other species. According to Rav Papa, these words represent the Mishnah's ruling that an ox known to be a muad regarding its own species is assumed not to be a muad regarding other species. So the Gemara sets forward the ramifications of this dispute. Rav Zvid said, but is not a muad, is what the Mishnah taught, meaning that the ox is known not to be a muad regarding other species. This implies that if the ox's tendencies regarding other species is not known, it's assumed to be a muad for all species. So bottom line, exactly as Gavin said, unless you've got evidence with witnesses to the contrary to show that it doesn't damage another species, or in a case where it damages an animal, it doesn't damage people, or a case where it damages young animals, it doesn't damage adults, the default position is we can assume that it will damage in all situations and with all species. Okay, unless evidence to the contrary. Rav Papa said, is not a muad, is what our Mishnah taught, meaning that if the ox's tendencies regarding other species are not known, it's assumed not to be muad regarding them. So the bottom line is all Rav Papa is saying is that unless we know otherwise, an ox can only establish a pattern as a muad regarding one species, but it is not necessarily that case with regards to another species. So, which means, in a simple practical term, is that if it's muad regarding oxen and I've got a donkey and it damages me, Arthur would only owe me half payment damages because it hasn't implied that it's damaged the donkey 3 times. Fine. So now we need evidence. Rav David and Rav Papa draw support for their views from the Mishnah. Rav David draws an inference from the Mishnah's latest statement. What do we mean the latest statement? Well, we're talking about the third statement, and I'm going to read it. It actually uses the term, just hang on a sec, guys. I'm just going to share my screen. The latter statement. So, what's his evidence? If you look, there are 3 statements. Let's look at the statements. Statement number 1, regarding, if it's muad regarding its own species, it's not muad regarding animals not of its own species. Okay? Statement number 2, an ox that is muad regarding people is not a muad regarding animals. Statement number 3, if one that is muad regarding young animals but is not a muad regarding mature animals, this is the law. So Rav David is using his evidence from the fact that it's saying that if it's muad regarding young animals, it's not regarding mature creatures. Okay? And then Rav Papa is, before we go into Rav Papa's explanation, just hang on, I've got this cat here. So, right, so if you want to say the Mishnah's ruling represents a novelty, so if you want to say that the Mishnah teaches that it's not a muad, which implies that if an ox's tendencies are not known, it's not assumed to be a muad regarding mature animals, you can argue as follows. If even from young animals of one species to young animals of other species, whose tendencies are not known, it's assumed not to be muad regarding other species, then from young animals to mature animals, is it even necessary to say that an ox is assumed not to be a muad regarding mature animals? This is obvious. So guys, do you know what it's saying? Gavin, you want to take a stab at it?
Let somebody else try. Gavin?
Mature, Damon.
Yeah?
Is the mature animals, maybe their appearance changes? Is maybe another animal doesn't recognize it? Maybe that's got as a factor, as you said earlier. Maybe I'm just having a guess.
So you're right in the sense that the appearance does make a difference, but for a different reason. So what
I'll give you that answer.
Yeah.
So I didn't hear you fully, but just on that one part, is that a young ox that kills it, that is muad to another young ox, is not going to go for an adult. It's just risky.
Okay.
Might not reckon.
It's a stupid thing to do. So it's highly unlikely a young ox is going to go after adult ox.
Okay, so I just want to take what Gavin's saying and follow it through. We're not talking about a young ox that's attacking. What we're saying is it's a fully grown ox that figures it's not going to get much competition by goring something half its size. It's not a young ox goring a young ox. It's a big and full-grown ox. And it figures it's a coward. It's not going to have a challenge. The reason why it wouldn't attack something bigger or the same size as it is it could end up in a far worse position. So how does this prove that what Rav David is saying? Because if it seems to actually agree with Rav Papa. Why? Because what Rav Papa is saying, look, if it's assumed dangerous and muad for young things, it's not necessarily assumed to be muad for mature things. This seems to support Rav Papa, not Rav David. This is the question I'm asking you guys. Is that when you first read it, this is evidence for Rav Papa, it would seem. Because Rav Papa is saying, if it gores young animals, okay, if it gores young animals, it wouldn't necessarily for something twice its size, because it wouldn't want to get obliterated. So does this seem like evidence for Rav Papa, Rav Zvid?
Would be, I think, for Rav Zvid. No, Rav Papa, because he said the one that if one doesn't go, automatically doesn't include the other.
Exactly. So when you first read this, it seems a little bit tricky. Guys, I might want to send a very short link for another worst case, because we're just on the precipice. I'm not going to go on. What I'm saying is as follows. When you read this and you say, look, Gavin said it right. This animal will pick on something half its size, but it won't pick on something twice its size. Meaning it's quite happy to be muad and have a history of attacking smaller creatures, puny creatures, but is very scared and bung to attack something that's twice its size or the same size. Therefore, that would seem to support Rav Papa, who says, listen, if it's muad and has a habitual nature to attack the young, it doesn't mean it's going to have an habitual nature to attack the big and the mature. That seems to support Rav Papa, not Rav Zvid. So why would Rav Zvid bring it as evidence? And why does it seem like the Gemara is bringing it for Rav Zvid? That's why I'm testing you guys, to bring out less than the obvious. Think about it for a sec.
But I want to hear it again so that I can come up with a better answer. All of us can.
Okay, so what is the question? State the question, Gav.
So the question is why is Rav what's his name? Zvi. What's his name again?
Zvid.
Zvid. Why is Rav Zvid bringing up an example that's actually pro what's his name?
Rav Papa.
Rav Papa, yeah. It seems to substantiate Rav Papa's theory as opposed to his theory.
And what is Rav Papa's theory, and why does it substantiate Rav Papa's theory?
Because Rav Papa says that an animal of one species won't attack an animal of another species, or even within the same species, if it's a calf versus a adult, and it's more on calves, it won't. It's probably, if it's never done an adult, it will probably won't do an adult.
Excellent.